So we are recording. I'm going to start lecture one. Again, my goal for us tonight is not to finish lecture one. It's just to start. And we will finish lecture one next class period. That's kind of the rhythm we will take. But so I'm going to share my screen again. There it is. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. And you'll notice I will ask that question every time because sometimes, Zoom can be finicky. But I just want to make sure you can. So what are we going to talk about in lecture one? Well, lecture one is designed to give you a brief overview of the concept of the history of psychology, what is unique about the history of psychology, and then it'll kind of like give foundational knowledge for the various subfields of psychology. So let us begin. It's interesting, the history of psychology, there's a paradox. You might hear psychology referred to as the oldest discipline, and you might hear psychology be referred to as one of the newest disciplines or scientific disciplines. And that's a paradox. How could it be both the oldest discipline and the newest discipline? Well, the answer is psychology is deeply rooted in philosophy, and the concepts that psychologists are interested in today we've been talking about for quite some time. So people like Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, they all were interested in things like learning, memory, motivation, psychopathology, even the concept of the mind, right, or the soul. They wondered whether the mind or soul is directly connected to the body or whether they were separate, right? So people like Rene Descartes talked about dualism as them being separate autonomous functions that interact. But because they're separate, when the body dies, the mind and or soul lives on, right? So this kind of discussion is deeply rooted in philosophy. So if we were to look at how old our discipline is, if we go back to Greek philosophy, we're looking at over 2,500 years old. But psychology as a science is fairly new, right? So when we think about it, psychology is, depending on how you start the clock, less than 200 years old, right? Now, there were emerging concepts as a science or formal discipline before we established psychology as a science. Does anyone know who is the pioneer that is considered the father of psychology? Anyone have a sense? Let me just call on someone. Chloe, who do you think is the founding father of psychology?
The only person I'm thinking of is Freud.
And that is incorrect, right? Most people, that is the answer that before we learn this class, 90% of people will say Freud. Freud is quite a dominant figure in our history due to personality theory and psychopathology, things like that. But he's not the originator or father of psychology. Rosa Maria?
Aren't there two founding fathers? They're both of their names start with William. William James.
Yes,
and William,
it's a debate. It's a good question.
Wundt. I don't know how to pronounce his last
Okay,
name.
so let me help you out. You are correct. So the person typically given credit as the founding father of psychology is Wilhelm Wundt. In German, W's are pronounced like V's. So Wilhelm Wundt established the first psychology laboratory in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. So typically, if you're opening an introduction to psychology textbook, you're going to see that Wundt is given credit. However, as we will learn, the concept of structuralism and sensation and perception, the way Wundt understood it, is very different than the way we understand it today. So most people want to give credit to William James, right? So William James was a philosopher, also a psychologist, right? And he wrote one of the first textbooks on the concept of psychology. But the reason why some people want to give more credit to William James is because his focus was on functionalism. So instead of looking at the structure of the mind, he looked at the practical or pragmatic sense of psychology. How does it promote survival? How does it help us? Why do we have this capability? And I will tell you that every major modern subfield of psychology owes some credit to William James. So you won't hear a person say, yeah, I'm a structuralist. You won't hear it. That whole subfield from Wundt and Titchener disappeared. It's gone. You will hear people talking about functional psychology. So developmental psychology is a functional subfield. Neuroscience or biological psychology is a functional subfield. And to some degree, it all goes back to William James. So that is a good answer. Can I ask you who taught you that? Because that is already like an upper level of knowledge.
I'm gonna look up her name right. I just took it this winter. For Psych 232.
While you're doing that, I'm going to continue, but they deserve a little praise for like really
good professor.
Say what?
She's a very good professor, very smart.
I could tell because there's nuance there, and she provided the nuance. So, but either way, whether we start the clock from Wundt or William James, this discipline.
Demina. Sorry to cut you off. Kristen Demina.
Nice. Very cool. Yeah. Thank you. So this discipline is maybe 200 years old. And some people start the formal discipline of psychology earlier than Wundt and James. Now, they're not giving credit as being the founding father of the field, but the precursors were there. So if we were to look at the British empiricists, and I have a lecture too, is all about the British empiricists, that brought psychology into a modern science perspective, that psychology is going to study things that are measurable, things that are observable, right? To greater or lesser degree. So the British empiricists and then the German physiologists. So neuroscience predates psychology as a discipline, and the German physiologists, people like Fechner and Weber, all of these individuals influenced the beginning of psychology. And I mention that because if you go by 1879 and you do the math, it doesn't add up to 200 years, right? So how do I suggest that it's still about 200 years old? Is the antecedents, the British empiricists and the German physiologists, their influence on the field was clear and present even before 1879. Questions? Any questions, comments, shrieks of outrage? All right. So I said all of this, and I know that it's good to be redundant in this particular class, but the paradox is resolved because psychology has an old mindset deeply rooted in philosophy. But as modern science evolves, psychology evolves as a science with it. So modern psychology, we follow all of the rules as any other scientific discipline, whether it be biology, chemistry, physics. Our hypothesis testing is consistent. Our level of significance, our statistical alpha, right, is the same. So we have adopted the same rigor and rules that other scientific disciplines have incorporated. So today we are considered a science, and some people argue, oh no, it's a soft science. Well, depends on the subdiscipline, but I will tell you that the National Science Foundation views psychology as a STEM discipline, a scientific discipline, because of the rigor in our research. So we adopt the concepts of biology and physiology that I mentioned. We rely on careful observation. We do hypothesis testing. And ultimately, psychology, as we talk about it today, is a fusion between philosophy and physiology. Okay, so you might be saying, gosh, why do I have to be in this class? And I'm kind of curious, by show of hands, if this course was not required, how many of you would take this course? And I won't be offended. So there's about 5 out of 35 people in the class, and it's going up a little bit, but it's safe to say that most people are psychology majors. They're not excited necessarily to take this course. And you might ask yourself, well, why are we required to do this? Well, what I will tell you is that it is required for several reasons. One, there's the American Psychological Association has learning benchmarks, and there's a gentleman by the name of Dana Dunn, D-U-N-N. He came up with different pockets of learning that prepares undergraduate students to be competent in the field and to prepare them for graduate school. And what he determined was the history of psychology was absolutely critical as a foundational course. And the College of Staten Island is no different than the vast majority of departments throughout the nation, based on the revelation that it's needed in, like, kind of putting all the pieces together in a foundational knowledge bit. About 2/3 of universities require the history of psychology, require it, not as an elective, but as part of the structure of the program. And believe it or not, the history of psychology has a history. We've been talking about the history of psychology as early as 1911. And by 1911, there's a lot that happens. We have Wundt, we have Titchener, we have Freud, we have Thorndike. There are a lot of major players and fairly common names that you might have heard. So we started to consolidate that information in history of psychology. Now, it does make psychology somewhat unique because you probably will not hear the history of photography, the history of making it up, the history of chemistry, these things. Most of the time people don't do that, but so psychology is fairly unique that we celebrate our history. As we go through the semester, I'm going to talk about people, and I'm also going to reveal aspects of who they are that were not as desirable. And we could criticize some of these individuals for their sexism. We could criticize some of these individuals for their racism, some of these individuals for their xenophobia. But we do not sanitize our history. We talk about these individuals because they were contributing members of the field, but we also put an asterisk by their name and talk about the other side because that's important too. Now, we have done a better job, I want to say in the last 20 to 30 years, talking about diversity factors in psychology, but the early face of psychology was very Eurocentric in its view and very patriarchal in its view. Things have shifted to some degree. Okay. So for us, we even have a sub-discipline, right? There are people who are not clinical psychologists, not cognitive psychologists, but there are people who get doctoral degrees in the history of psychology. And if you go to places like York University, that's a Canadian institution, University of New Hampshire, University of Florida, UPenn, and many others, you can get a doctorate in the history of psychology the same way you could get a doctorate in social psych, developmental psych, clinical psych, and so forth. We also have scientific journals that are focused specifically on the history of psychology. So I'm trying to remember whether, I think it's Division 1 of the American Psychological Association. No, I think I take that back. That might be general psychology. There is a division within the American Psychological Association dedicated to the history of psychology. I'm drawing a blank on which number it is at the moment, but it's important to note. And each division of the American Psychological Association has the opportunity to have a scientific journal, and we have a journal called the History of Psychology. All right. So we talk about degree programs, we talk about scientific journals, and we even have formal organizations that are dedicated to history of behavioral sciences. And I'm probably going to butcher this, as I always do. I think it's the Sharon Society, and that is a society that is an international community focused on the history of behavioral sciences. So no problem. Someone lost service, they let me know. That's okay. All right, so we require it. We believe it's important for you. We've demonstrated its relevance to the discipline of psychology, but you might still be like, well, what's in it for me? Well, one thing that's in it for you is that you'll be able to appreciate the amazing diversity of the field, right? When people think of psychology, they don't initially think of psychology as a science, and they don't initially think of all of the subdisciplines. So if you were to ask the average person on the street, what do you think a psychologist does? They will tell you they do therapy. And by the end of this semester, you'll realize that there are so many other things that we do. Now, I am a clinical psychologist, so I do therapy, but not every psychologist is a clinical psychologist. So by the end of this semester, you'll start to see all the major subfields, how they emerged, and we could talk about what that means for you in terms of after you graduate from CSI. All right. Now, history also serves as a framework to discuss important topics within the field. Every theory is a set of beliefs or a framework that we operate based on, a set of assumptions. So when we talk about history, there's a series of theories and frameworks we operate based on. It also allows us to see how all of the parts come together. I had one of the students earlier say that they took 232, which is biological psychology. How does biological psychology fit with the history of psychology? Well, you're going to learn that in lecture 3. You're going to see all about that. But you'll start to see on a macro level how it all fits together. And people like me who love history, we're curious about history in its own right. So psychology is no different, right? So we're curious, and that keeps us here. So in this class, we're going to be doing historiography, which is basically applying the research strategies for historical data points. And psychology is complicated because history is fragmented. When we think about stories, we're learning about different major players today that weren't made public earlier. It's a fragmented discipline. So we have to find ways to put the data fragments together. And a historiography gives us a set of principles to do so. How do we put our history together in a meaningful way? So, as I said, history of psychology is very, very complicated. All history in general is complicated. How do we understand who people were, the life events that they experienced, and their value system? When I teach about Sigmund Freud, I oftentimes say, if Freud were to present his ideas today, he would not have a long career in this discipline. Because when you talk about concepts like penis envy, well, that implies that there's this male superiority, which is sexist, right? His psychosexual stages, which refer to homosexuality as an anal fixation, would be considered homophobic. So we have to put people in their appropriate context in this class. So we're trying to understand, where did these ideas come from? Was it a prevalent idea in their day? And that's how we see growth processes. When we see, wow, I can't believe we once adopted this philosophy, right? Because once you discover that idea is incorrect, we all engage in a hindsight bias. Like, how could people have ever thought that? It's so obvious. But in history, it's not so clear. So we try and put people in their context. And we have this discussion Several years back, there was a discussion about Civil War generals and the statues, whether or not they should be removed, whether they should be, stay in place, whether they should be put in a museum. And, different people landed in different points or at different points on this discussion. And it's not a simple one because the statues were erected in a time period where they thought that this was a person of importance. Whether that person was important for good or for bad, we have the ability to look back and say, hey, yeah, maybe we shouldn't be celebrating this person anymore. But in that day, they were viewed as someone important. So we wrestle with this. Anyone who loves history, you wrestle, how much attention do we give someone who is bigoted? How much attention do we give a person who had a philosophy that was entirely incorrect? We're going to talk about people like Franz Gall and the concept of phrenology. Well, Franz Gall and the idea of phrenology was entirely wrong. Yet I keep, I'm going to point to it, a phrenology head on my bookshelf as a reminder. We talk about these things. And I'm going to tell you why, even though phrenology was entirely wrong, why it was important to our history. We'll get that, I believe, in lecture 3. So we try and wrestle, we try and put things into context, but not everything comes out all at once. So the best way to view history and the history of psychology, treat it like it's archaeology. It's kind of like an archaeologist digs in the dirt and finds this little piece of maybe a pottery shard, and then they dig a little bit further, they find another piece, and then they put it all together as a larger understanding, right? The history of psychology is like that too. It's fragmented. Not everything is there. We find letters that make people look different once we have these letters. We have a different understanding of who the person was. We have in the Library of Congress letters written from different major people to either a client or one of their mentees that are sealed, and they're to be opened at later points in time. So we don't always have all the information. So it's history. We have to always be open to like modifying our understanding as more information comes out. I'll give you one more example. So I talked to you about Freud and the complexity of Freud's ideas. I talked to you about Franz Gall and phrenology, and we talk about that as part of our history, even though it's incorrect. We have different theories of personality, and there is a biologically based theory that suggests that there are 3 factors of personality, that being neuroticism, psychoticism, and I'm drawing a blank on the 3rd. But nevertheless, we discovered that this person faked the data, so a lot of their ideas were made up. So what do you do when you have a major person in the field who comes under question about their ideas? Well, then we potentially discard some of their ideas. And that's really the discussion that we're stuck with, is do we keep it? Oh, Eysenck, Eysenck, right? So Eysenck was a major player in the field of personality theory. So it's extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. These are the big three. But yet, I think a lot of his data was made up. So do we throw out everything about his ideas or not? We're still wrestling with this. I'll give you another example. Thorndike. Thorndike is viewed as a major player in learning and behaviorism. And, he came up with the concept of the law of effect, which is basically a precursor to operant conditioning. And I'll explain that when we get there. But we discover that Thorndike was racist and sexist, and he was hired by Columbia University to find a way to exclude Jewish individuals and create a quota that would disadvantage Jewish individuals so that they wouldn't be able to be admitted. And Columbia University, or Teachers College, at the time of his hire had something like over 20% of the student body was Jewish. By the time he created his quotas and his system, it dropped down to less than 10%. So he really found a way to exclude Jewish individuals and not give them positions based on merit. That's anti-Semitism. So when we started to become more aware of these things, Columbia University had a very tough decision to make, because one of their major buildings was called Thorndike Hall. They named it after Thorndike. And the question was, do they remove his name from that hall? And ultimately they did. Based on what we know today, maybe this isn't a person we want to celebrate, even though they contributed to psychology. So it's messy, but as more information comes out, we have to be open to, filling in the gaps of understanding. And sometimes we see people very differently. So we also know that due to war, fires, things like that, things get destroyed. And we know that before the digital age, people wrote on paper, things get stored away. So here are a couple examples where we found major manuscripts after the person died. So Hermann Ebbinghaus, which was a major influential figure in memory, we found a whole bunch of Ebbinghaus papers after he was dead, 75 years. And our whole concept of learning, memory, forgetting, and relearning is based on Ebbinghaus, right? So that changes a lot of how we think about cognition. Or Gustav Fechner, right? 1983, almost 100 years later, we find diaries. So we're talking about, information we don't even know exists until a later point. So our understanding of Ebbinghaus and Fechner today is much greater than it was, 100 years ago. And our appreciation for their work and their science is improved based on these papers and diaries and things like that. So there are a lot of things like that. You can go on YouTube and watch the unsealing of certain documents. Sometimes the Library of Congress makes a big deal when they open up a box or they open up a letter from a major historical person, because they know that it's going to fill in a gap or two. Now, other elements, there are factors that are suppressed. We talk about Sigmund Freud, and we have a bunch of Freud's letters which were intentionally set at certain dates to be opened. So if you look from Freud's oldest son, there was a letter that was open in 2013, which revealed a little bit about their relationship. And there's another one to be open in 2032. So our understanding of who Freud, the person, was is incomplete. And one of Freud's mentors is going to be 2102. So we have to wait 82 years for this. I may not even be around when that happened. No, it is very unlikely I will be around in 2102. But some of you might be centenarians. You might be over 100 years old when this happens. And, you know, how we teach Freud in 2102 might be different. So I bring this up because sometimes information is even suppressed intentionally. Now you might say, well, why would they not open up this letter from Freud's son or from one of his mentors? The answer is that we oftentimes think about collateral damage, the unintended consequence. If there's an identifiable person who could be negatively impacted by unsealing the letter, we go so far out in the future that we try and predict that that damage would be significantly reduced or eliminated. So you'll see even suppressed data. Now, we also have historians who write biographies that are intentionally exaggerated. So if we think about politics, right, many presidents have biographies on them. And depending on who the biographer was, they might paint this person in an overly favorable or an undesirable light, depending on who they are. And that's why you'll see the unauthorized biography of Ronald Reagan. Why is it called unauthorized? It was written about Ronald Reagan without input from Ronald Reagan. So sometimes people have an agenda to boost an individual up. Sometimes they might have an agenda to be overly critical. So examples we have is, you know, with Freud, his cocaine use and how much he thought it was this wonder drug isn't talked about enough. So his biographer kind of in passing mentions that his dissertation was called Uber Coca, which is the greatness or wonder of cocaine. But he didn't cover the extent to which Freud used cocaine, got his best friend hooked on cocaine, who ultimately overdoses from cocaine, and the fact that he mailed cocaine to his fiance, Martha Bernays, and says, here, try this, because the next time we're physically intimate, I'm going to be a wild stallion with this running through my veins, right? The biographer didn't cover any of that, right? And, you know, we wonder how much substance abuse impacted some of Freud's ideas. Carl Jung is known to have slept with many of his patients. Yet in his biography, they don't tell the whole story. They try and make him out to be more of a family man than is true. So sometimes we're trying to protect the identity. Sometimes if it's an autobiography, sometimes people exaggerate how great they were themselves. I'll give you an example before I get into the translation issue. As it relates to Skinner, Skinner describes his time in graduate school as if he woke up at like 6, the numbers are not exact, but woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning, went straight to the lab, did research, grabbed a quick bite for lunch, went back to the lab, and was the last person to leave the lab. So that gives the impression that Skinner was this hardworking individual, very studious, and really didn't give himself any liberties. When you hear from Skinner's classmates, they said he barely was in the lab. He was playing ping pong more than he was actually in the lab. And that tells the story, because when Skinner describes his youth and how he worked in graduate school, it's far more favorable than is true. Now, let me do the data lost in translation or distorted. Another issue we have in the field of psychology is that the earliest pioneers were German. And there are concepts that are written about that don't translate easily into English. So things like free association. Well, free association is you say whatever comes to mind, and something relevant from the unconscious will pop up, right? We need a whole bunch of words to say that. But the German word is Einfall, which is kind of like an intrusive thought that pushes itself into your head. We don't describe free association in English as clearly as that. Or the ego. What is the ego? Well, people use ego differently, but in German, it's the Ich, which is the I, or the sense of self, right? It doesn't translate very good into English. Other things like Zeitgeist. The Zeitgeist is the socio-political spirit of the times. Basically, what was the culture in that time period? And every time period has its own climate, historical climate. And it's hard to pinpoint that, but there's no English word or equivalent to zeitgeist. We have to spend a great deal of time trying to explain what it is. Or gestalt, right? The composite, right? Or configuration. That's important to sensation and perception, but we don't have a word that perfectly explains this. And you get the idea. So sometimes things are distorted in translation, lost in translation, non-equivalence in translation, and then sometimes either people distort it themselves as a participant or observer. Now, I mentioned to you about Skinner, right? I said he portrayed himself more favorably than was true. So the nose to the grindstone. So this is the actual quote from Skinner. I would rise at 6, study till breakfast, go to classes, laboratories, and libraries with no more than 15 minutes of unscheduled time. I saw no movies or plays, seldom went to concerts, and went on no dates, right? Or had no dates, right? This makes it sound like, wow, this is such a hardworking person, when his colleagues, said, no, this isn't true. This is not what we saw. And then Freud, if you look at Freud's writing, Freud would say nobody liked psychoanalysis. Everybody was critical of psychoanalysis. And he was kind of like a martyr to the cause and suffering the criticism of so many people. When in reality, in the early 1900s, I would say Freud was the most popular individual. He was a celebrity figure, to the point where he was invited from Vienna to Clark University to give a presentation on psychology. They flew him in. They like wined and dined him because he was such a celebrated individual. So our understanding of Freud and the narratives that are written about Freud may not be entirely true. So let's put a pin in here. So I'm going to stop my share, and I'm going to stop the recording. and we will continue next week. Now, because I know some people join late, I'm not going to do attendance for today's class. I'm going to give everybody full credit, but we'll start with attendance exactly at 4:40 in our next class. So let's stop there.